Well, of course, I had to take the time to talk about the recent report from Plus 972 and Local Call about the Lavender program, an artificial intelligence-based system which generates kill lists. I've read a lot of very upsetting material throughout this genocide taking place in the Gaza Strip. I've made a lot of videos about them. Though this one stands out as among the most chilling of reports that I have ever read in my entire life. You'll soon see why. The report is valuable in a number of ways, not least of which being its perfect debunking of the Israeli claim that the high number of civilian casualties in its massive bombing of the Gaza Strip is a result of Hamas using them as so-called human shields. I've not taken much time to address the Israeli human shields claim since logically it was so stupid. Even granting, in theory, Hamas shelters under hospitals or refugee camps, and that's why Israel has to bomb them, Israel dropping enough bombs on this tiny enclave more than any bombing campaign of the current century.
Robert Pate is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. You've studied extensively on the issue of coercive bombing.
I've studied every strategic bombing campaign since World War I. What I can tell you is that Israel's bombing campaign is one of the most intense civilian punishment campaigns in history. We are seeing one of the most intense civilian bombing campaigns in history.
Destroying it worse than World War II Germany obviously renders human shields completely meaningless. This is what I knew before reading the new report from 972 and Local Call. The reality, much to my surprise, is even worse. The article's author, Yuval Abraham, explains how the Israeli Defense Forces felt about 972 and Local Call's reporting. In a statement to 972 and Local Call, the IDF spokesperson claimed in response to this article that Hamas places its operatives and military assets in the heart of the civilian population, systematically uses the civilian population as human shields, and conducts fighting from within civilian structures, including sensitive sites such as hospitals, mosques, schools, and UN facilities. The IDF is bound by and acts according to international law, directing its attacks only at military targets and military operatives. However, in contrast to the Israeli army's official statements, sources explained that a major source for the unprecedented death toll from Israel's current bombardment is the fact that the army has systematically attacked targets in their private homes, alongside their families, in part because it was easier from an intelligence standpoint to mark family houses using automated systems. Aside from revealing the existence of Lavender, 972 and Local Call also unearthed a system Israeli forces used to trace Hamas officials to their private homes. You see, rather than making painstaking decisions about how many civilians to blow up when targeting a Hamas terrorist cowardly shielding himself in a school, the Israeli military has made the decision to go after targets in what can only be described as the most cowardly way possible, in the middle of the night when he's sleeping with his entire family. They call it, "Where's Daddy?" We're not interested in killing Hamas operatives only when they were in a military building or engaged in a military activity, an intelligence officer told 972 and Local Call. On the contrary, the IDF bombed them in homes without hesitation as a first option. It's much easier to bomb a family's home. The system is built to look for them in these situations. Where's Daddy acted as a home tracking system. A explained the marked person would be placed under ongoing surveillance and could be attacked as soon as they set foot in their home, collapsing the house on everyone inside. Let's say you calculate that there is one Hamas operative plus 10 civilians in the house, A said. Usually these 10 will be women and children. So absurdly, it turns out that most of the people you killed were women and children. Checks out.
About how many Palestinian women and children have been killed by Israel since October 7th?
It's over 25,000.
According to another source in the story, B, a senior officer who used Lavender, at 5 a.m., the Air Force would come and bomb all the houses that we had marked. We took out thousands of people. We didn't go through them one by one. We put everything into automated systems. Unsurprisingly, this surveillance of targets and tracing them to their homes was fundamentally flawed in a number of tragic ways. According to B, most of the mistakes caused by Lavender occurred if the Hamas target gave his phone to his son, his older brother, or just a random man. That person will be bombed in his house with his family. This happened often. One source described a similar incident that affected him and made him want to be interviewed for this investigation. We understood that the target was home at 8 p.m. In the end, the Air Force bombed the house at 3 a.m. Then we found out in that span of time he had managed to move himself to another house with his family. There were 2 other families with children in the building we bombed. It happened to me many times that we attacked a house, but the person wasn't even home, one source said. The result is that you killed a family for no reason. The number of targets feverishly generated by officers seeking to pad their kill lists grew to as many as 37,000, people who, in theory, were to be bombed in their private residences, killing many more uninvolved and innocent women and children. Tens of thousands were generated by lowering the threshold for targeting used in previous Israeli massacres in the Gaza Strip, such as in 2008 and 9 and 2014. AI-generated targeting is a very recent phenomenon, and a model for the current onslaught in Gaza can be found in the widespread bombing of the Strip in 2021, what Israel dubbed Guardian of the Walls. The first digital war, in the words of Unit 8200 data science and AI commander Colonel Yoav. According to Yoav, who was speaking at the AI conference at Tel Aviv University, the IDF was able to target at least one of the Hamas squad missile commanders and one of the Hamas anti-tank missile units using data science and AI capabilities. In all, he said new digital methods helped produce 200 new target assets during the 10-day operation. With the technological developments brought by the 2021 bombing campaign and the Israeli bloodlust following October 7th, a drastic change in Israeli military policy would help produce the staggering and unprecedented casualty figures we see today. 972 and local call found. In the past, the military did not authorize any collateral damage during assassinations of low-ranking militants. In an unprecedented move, according to 2 of the sources, the Army has decided during the first weeks of the war that for every junior Hamas operative that Lavender marked, it was permissible to kill up to 15 or 20 civilians. What's worse, according to the sources, when it came to targeting alleged junior militants marked by Lavender, the Army preferred to only use unguided missiles, commonly known as dumb bombs, in contrast to smart precision bombs, which can destroy entire buildings on top of their occupants and cause significant casualties. You don't want to waste expensive bombs on unimportant people. It's very expensive for the country, and there's a shortage of those bombs, said C, one of the intelligence officers. Another source said that they had personally authorized the bombing of hundreds of private homes of alleged junior operatives marked by Lavender, with many of these attacks killing civilians and entire families as collateral damage. It was very surprising for me that we were asked to bomb a house to kill a ground soldier, whose importance in the fighting was so low, said one source about the use of AI to mark alleged low-ranking militants. I nicknamed those targets garbage targets. Still, I found them more ethical than the targets that we bombed just for deterrence, high-rises that are evacuated and toppled just to cause destruction. This was reported by 972 and Local Call in November of 2023 in a bombshell article about the widespread use of a system called Habzora, or the Gospel. These bombings, which were intended solely to cause destruction, were aimed at private residences as well as public buildings, infrastructure, and high-rise blocks, which sources say the Army defines as power targets. According to intelligence sources who had first-hand experience with its application in Gaza in the past, it is mainly intended to harm Palestinian civil society, to create a shock that, among other things, will reverberate powerfully and lead civilians to put pressure on Hamas, as one source put it. As opposed to Gospel's use in targeting structures and whole neighborhood blocks, Lavender, in conjunction with tracking technology like Where's Daddy, are used to place people on kill lists. Along with including simple junior officers who were to be killed in their homes with their families, the list also at times reportedly included children. Another source said even some minors were marked by Lavender as targets for bombing. Normally, operatives are over the age of 17, but that was not a condition. 972 and Local Call give a detailed account of the several weeks of chaos that marked the beginning of the Gaza genocide, though chaos has continued, albeit with different characteristics. Sources told 972 and Local Call that now, partly due to American pressure, the Israeli army is no longer mass-generating junior human targets for bombing in civilian homes. The fact that most homes in the Gaza Strip were already destroyed or damaged, and almost the entire population has been displaced, also impaired the army's ability to rely on intelligence databases and automated house locating programs. Airstrikes against senior-ranking Hamas commanders are still ongoing, and sources said that for these attacks, the military is authorizing the killing of hundreds of civilians per target, an official policy for which there is no historical precedent in Israel or even in recent U.S. military operations. In the bombing of the commander of the Shujaa battalion, we knew that we would kill over 100 civilians. Be recalled of a December 2nd bombing. In order to assassinate Ayman Nofal, the commander of Hamas's Central Gaza Brigade, a source said that the army authorized the killing of approximately 300 civilians, destroying several buildings and airstrikes on Al-Bureij refugee camp on October 17th. Though the Israeli military, again in a deviation from its conduct in previous bloodbaths in Gaza, have not even taken the trouble to accurately tally their killed. Indeed, in years past, after bombing targets slated for assassination, Israeli intelligence would typically carry out a bomb damage assessment, a routine post-strike check to see if the senior commander was killed and how many civilians were killed along with them. This reportedly involved listening in to phone calls of relatives who lost their loved ones. But this time round, sources say this procedure was abolished in order to save time. The sources said they did not know how many civilians were actually killed in each strike, and for the low-ranking suspected Hamas and PIG operatives marked by AI, they did not even know whether the target himself was killed. You don't know exactly how many you killed and who you killed, an intelligence source told Local Call. Only when it's senior Hamas operatives do you follow the BDA procedure. In the rest of the cases, you don't care. You get a report from the Air Force about whether the building was blown up, and that's it. You have no idea how much collateral damage there was. You immediately move on to the next target. The emphasis was to create as many targets as possible, as quickly as possible. And this is precisely why the Israeli military has itself relied almost exclusively on data from the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza, what all Western news essentially calls the Hamas-run health ministry. They have reproduced these figures in celebration of their perceived successes, writes UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories Francesca Albanese in her recent searing report, Anatomy of a Genocide. 70% of recorded deaths have consistently been women and children. Israel failed to prove that the remaining 30%, i.e. adult males, were active Hamas combatants, a necessary condition for them to be lawfully targeted. By early December, Israel's security advisors claimed the killing of 7,000 terrorists. In a stage of the campaign when less than 5,000 adult males in total had been identified among the casualties, thus implying that all adult males killed were terrorists. This is indicative of an intent to indiscriminately target members of the protected group, assimilating them to active fighter status by default. Albanese further provides data which serves to substantiate the lethal targeting programs employed by Israel in Gaza. 70% of residential areas have been destroyed. Since October 7th, Israel has killed over 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza. By the end of February, a further 12,000 Palestinians were reported missing, presumed dead under the rubble. Indeed, any argument in favor of human shields suffers in light of the simply stated fact, stated in one cruel sentence of Francesca Albanese's report, that after 5 months of military operations, Israel has destroyed Gaza. Surely another source of the astronomical casualties was the bombing of areas officially deemed by Israel to be safe from bombing. Of the roughly 500 2,000-pound bombs dropped by Israel in the first 6 weeks of hostilities, Albanese writes, 42% were deployed in the designated safe zones in southern areas. As a result, by October 28th, 2 weeks after Israel's mass evacuation order, about 38% of killings in Gaza occurred in the declared safe zones. By January 22nd, 42% were located in the area, which by then held the majority of the Gaza population. Simply put, safe areas were deliberately turned into areas of mass killing. A report published in late March by UNICEF, Education Cluster, and Save the Children further substantiated the targeting of these so-called safe areas. They sadly report that of the 563 school buildings in Gaza, 212 have been directly hit by bombs. 165 of those were in areas designated for evacuation by the Israeli military. Just days after October 7th, the Jerusalem Post reported that IDF Air Force Chief Brigadier General Omer Tischler said the IDF is not targeting civilians as Hamas did in mass numbers on Saturday and continues to do with rocket fire. There is always a military target, but we are not being surgical. Tactically, he explained that if in past rounds of fighting with Gaza, the Air Force would target 1 or 2 Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad targets or high-ranking officers at a time, now it is targeting whole neighborhoods of terrorist targets all at once. So, targeting not only senior Hamas commanders, but also simple junior officers, killing entire families, bombing civilian infrastructure just to instill fear in the population, bombing the south of Gaza despite designating it a safe zone, renders the argument of human shield so asinine that it's barely worthy of any mention at all. But what makes it even more utterly stupid is that the deaths and the conditions calculated to bring about those deaths are by no means limited to those bombings, but also starvation as well. A deliberate policy which by definition does not distinguish between military or civilian, man or woman, woman or child. It is a purely indiscriminate civilian punishment measure calculated to bring about death to the whole of the population. In other words, genocide. As Albanese sadly reports, Israel's heightened blockade of Gaza has caused death by starvation, including 10 children daily, by impeding access to vital supplies. A report from Oxfam sheds light on the, as they put it plainly, deliberate restrictive actions that have led to a severe and systemic dysfunctionality in the delivery of aid. The conditions we have observed in Gaza are beyond catastrophic, and we have not only seen failure by Israeli authorities to meet their responsibility to facilitate and support international aid efforts, but in fact seen active steps being taken to hinder and undermine such aid efforts. Examples include, on December 21st, an Israeli airstrike targeted the Karem Abu Salem border crossing area in southern Gaza, killing the director responsible for coordinating humanitarian aid entry. This attack not only disrupted the critical flow of aid, but also raised concerns over violations of international humanitarian law, which mandates the protection of humanitarian personnel. The Karim Abu Salem crossing has much wider capacity to scan and process cargo, but Israeli authorities have not made it fully operational. The Eretz crossing remains closed, making it impossible to reach North Gaza without having to cross the entire strip under constant Israeli bombing. Of course, I've reported here before, including in December, Human Rights Watch describing the Israeli government using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare in the Gaza Strip, which is a war crime. That Israeli forces are deliberately blocking the delivery of water, food, and fuel. Just in November 2023, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported 7 water facilities across the Gaza Strip were directly hit and sustained major damage, including 3 sewage pipelines in Gaza City, 2 water reservoirs, and 2 water wells. Euromed Human Rights Monitor had themselves reported, also in November, that the Israeli war of starvation has taken very dangerous turns, including cutting off all food supplies to the northern half and bombing and destroying factories, bakeries, food stores, water stations, and tanks throughout the entire enclave. Speaking of Euromed Monitor, they actually released a new report just days ago, which has apparently not been reported on widely. The apt title reads, "Killing Starving Palestinians, Targeting Aid Trucks is a Deliberate Israeli Policy to Reinforce Famine in the Gaza Strip." They detail numerous instances of Israel targeting aid convoys, those waiting for aid, and officials responsible for overseeing not only its distribution, but also guarding convoys to avoid looting, examples that can hardly be attributed to Hamas using human shields. The situation has gotten so dire, Euromed Monitor write, that between January 11th and March 23rd, 2024, Euromed Monitor documented the killing of 563 Palestinians and the injury of 1,523 others due to the Israeli army's targeting of people waiting for aid, distribution centers, and those responsible for organizing, protecting, and distributing aid in the Gaza Strip. Evidence suggests that Israel intentionally perpetrates these crimes, including direct military attacks on humanitarian aid and civilians, as part of a deliberate and overarching policy. This is evident from the systematic pattern and regular, almost daily recurrence of Israel's commission of these crimes, as well as the high number of victims affected by them. They provide an exhaustive timeline. These are among the most noteworthy examples provided in the report, which I'll include here. On targeting starving civilians waiting for humanitarian aid, on January 11th, 2024, the Israeli army killed approximately 50 Palestinians and wounded dozens of others when quadcopter aircraft opened fire on Palestinian crowds who had gathered to receive quantities of flour loaded by UN trucks on Al-Rashid Street in west of Gaza City. On January 22nd, the Israeli army fired artillery shells at hundreds of hungry civilians who had gathered on Salah al-Din Road in southeast of Gaza City. On February 25th, 10 Palestinians were killed and 20 others injured after being targeted by Israeli army forces while waiting for aid trucks near the Nabulsi roundabout on Al-Rashid Street in the southwest of Gaza City. On February 29th, 118 people were killed and 760 others injured on Al-Rashid Street, south of Gaza City, while waiting for aid supplies. The Euromed Monitor field team documented the brutal Israeli massacre of Palestinians, confirming that Israeli tanks opened fire and shells at around 4:30 a.m. directly into a crowd of thousands of hungry civilians. The civilians had been waiting hours for aid trucks to arrive near the Nabulsi roundabout on Al-Rashid Street. On March 2nd, 1 Palestinian was killed and more than 20 others injured after being targeted while waiting for aid supplies at Al-Rashid Street in March 3rd. Several people were killed and injured after being shot while waiting for aid supplies at the Kuwait roundabout in Gaza City. On March 9th, at least 2 Palestinians were killed and 18 others injured when Israeli army forces targeted crowds of people waiting for aid at the Kuwait and Nabulsi roundabouts in March 11th, 9 Palestinians were killed and others injured after Israeli army forces opened fire at those waiting for aid trucks at the Kuwait roundabout southeast of Gaza City. On March 13th, 6 Palestinians were killed and others injured while waiting for aid supplies to arrive at the Kuwait roundabout on the outskirts of Gaza City. On March 14th, Israeli army forces opened heavy fire on thousands of civilians who had gathered near the Kuwait roundabout at the Salah al-Din Road in southern Gaza City using tanks, helicopters, and drones. The shooting left more than 80 dead and 200 injured, with a number of them left in critical condition. The next morning, Israeli army forces opened fire on residents who returned to the scene in an attempt to retrieve the bodies of the victims. Additionally, Euromed write, Israel has targeted humanitarian aid distribution centers, including on February 7th, when 13 Palestinians were killed and several others injured when a water distribution truck was bombed in Gaza City as people gathered to fill their water barrels. On March 13th, Israeli aircraft bombed the UNRWA-run humanitarian aid distribution headquarters in the administrative district of Rafah while employees were distributing flour to the residents. The bombing killed 6 civilians, including a child and an UNRWA employee, and injured several others, including 22 UNRWA employees. On March 14th, Israeli aircraft bombed an aid distribution center run by the Ministry of Social Development in the Nusrat refugee camp in the central Gaza Strip, killing 8 people and wounding several. On March 18th, Israeli aircraft bombed an aid, storage, and distribution center east of Jabalia refugee camp in North Gaza Governorate, killing 2 people working in aid distribution. There's also targeting humanitarian aid convoys. On February 5th, Israeli forces bombed an UNRWA aid convoy heading toward northern Gaza in Deir al-Balah in the middle of the Strip, despite pre-coordinating with parties to the conflict. On February 5th, again, an aid convoy came under heavy Israeli fire while heading to northern Gaza. No casualties were reported, according to the deputy humanitarian coordinator. On March 3rd, 2 Israeli missiles bombed an aid truck in Deir al-Balah, killing 9 civilians and wounding others, including civilians gathered around it. When it comes to targeting workers distributing humanitarian aid, on January 21st, an Israeli warplane bombed a car carrying government employees responsible for coordinating aid entry, killing 3 people, including Ahmed Jamal Abu Mansour, head of the Emergency Committee of the Ministry of Social Development. On February 20th, an Israeli drone bombed a civilian car west of the Shabura refugee camp in Rafah, killing. On March 13th, an Israeli drone bombed a civilian car in the Kerba al-Adas neighborhood in Rafah. On March 18th, 2 aid distribution workers were killed when Israeli aircraft targeting an aid storage center east of Jabalia camp in northern Gaza. On March 19th, the Israeli army killed the director of the Emergency Committee in western Gaza at the Kuwait roundabout in Gaza City while he was supervising aid entry and distribution. Regarding targeting those responsible for securing and protecting humanitarian aid. On March 18th, 2024, the director of the Nusrat police station, Mahmoud al-Bayoumi, was killed in an Israeli bombing that targeted a car in front of the UNRWA headquarters in Nusrat in the central Gaza Strip. 3 civilians were killed in the attack, including 2 young sisters. On the evening of the same day, the Israeli army killed 30 members of the police and civilian committees charged with protecting aid trucks in an Israeli bombing near the Kuwait roundabout in southern Gaza City. This is part of Israel's policy of clearing the way for the looting of humanitarian aid and exacerbating the famine. On January 9th, the Israeli army opened heavy gunfire at a group of police officers as they attempted to secure the entry of humanitarian supplies into Gaza City. Many of them were killed and injured during the incident. On February 6, 6 Palestinian police officers were killed when a police vehicle guarding an aid truck was bombed in the Kerbat al-Adas. The Israeli army killed Fayek al-Mabou, director of Central Police Operations. The Israeli army also killed Lieutenant Colonel Raed al-Bana, along with his wife and children, after bombing his house on March 18th. Al-Bana was responsible for securing the entry of aid trucks into northern Gaza. Of course, they felt compelled to address Israel's attempts to evade responsibility for the massacres. Regarding the most well-known and deadliest flour massacre at the Nablusi roundabout in the southwest of Gaza City on February 29th, Euromed Human Rights Monitor confirmed full Israeli involvement in the crime. Many victims of the massacre suffered injuries from 5.56 NATO bullets. This is a type of bullet fired from Israeli army weapons. A sample of 200 dead and injured victims revealed that they were indeed hit by this type of bullet, which was discovered and examined at the massacre site. These, simply put, were clearly just people, human beings, and not simply something that can so easily be written off as human shields.